Now let's turn our attention to the ACEC Research Institute and its new economic report for the engineering industry. Last year, the Institute published landmark research that profiled our industry's size and its impact on the economy. That was critical ammunition for our advocacy efforts. For the first time, we had hard numbers that detailed engineering's true value in terms of dollars and jobs. Today, the Institute will unveil the initial findings of its new report, along with results from its recent executive sentiment study. To get this afternoon's program started, please welcome Joe Bates from the ACEC Research Institute and Aaron McLaughlin, ACEC's President for Private Markets. Joe, get 'em. Go get 'em.
Thank you so much, Linda. I can speak on behalf of myself and Aaron. We're very excited to be sharing with you today the research that we've been working on over the last several months. As Linda mentioned, last year we unveiled the very first economic forecast for the engineering and design services industry. This year, you all are going to get a preview of the second annual engineering and design services industry forecast. It has not yet been released. We're going to share with you some of the highlights, and in the coming week or so, we'll be unveiling the research in totality. We're also going to talk about, as Linda mentioned, a brand new ACEC Research Institute Engineering Sentiment Study. It's the first of its kind ever conducted, and we'll be sharing with you some numbers from that today as well. Finally, Erin will be talking about the private market and her data that she collects regularly every year. She's been doing this for years and years, so she is, of course, extremely knowledgeable about the market. Ken McGill, who is not able to be here with us today, is going to share with us on video the highlights of the economic industry forecast. So for the next 5 minutes and 12 seconds, please pay attention to the screens behind me.
Thanks for the intro, Joe, and welcome to our session on what lies ahead for the engineering and design services industry. My job is to introduce our session and share some of the top-level findings of our most recent industry outlook. So let's jump right in. Any good industry outlook always starts with a review of where we are now. In particular, 2020 as our jump-off point for our industry outlook. Here are some of the top-line numbers on the slide in front of you now. Industry revenue, unfortunately, was down about 7.2%. It reached $338 billion in 2020. Some of the other top-line metrics that you see there were down by a commensurate amount. Yet, the statistics associated with the engineering and design services labor market actually fared much better. In particular, you can see that about 1.5 million jobs were retained in our industry during this pandemic recession. That was a decline of only 1.2%. And even when we look at wages, we actually had an increase of almost 4% in average wages. So there's a bit of a mixed performance message there. Just to put some of this in perspective, okay, employment fell in our industry by 1.2%. Total US employment was down by 5.8%. And it's really a story of have and have nots. For example, warehousing employment, real estate employment, both grew by more than 9% in 2020. On the other side of that coin, we have air, transportation, we have hotels, we have restaurants. Air down by 15%, hotels down by a full 27% in 2020. Suffice it to say that the pandemic recession was uneven across sectors, across regions, across occupations, even across income cohorts. The economic contribution of our industry, however, remains significant. Our $338 billion, which you see at the far left of this slide, still translated into $518 billion in contribution to US GDP. That results in a multiplier of more than 1.5, 1.5. That's an impressive performance for our industry. So let's jump right into the outlook itself. This is a picture of our current baseline outlook. It calls for a quick snapback in 2021. You can see the blue growth rate there at 8.1%. Many of you are already experiencing this rise. Looking at some of the more recent high frequency indicators, we see that September year-to-date revenue was actually up by 12% over the year before, and employment grew by more than 4% during that same period. Residential construction, warehouse construction is largely behind the early stages of this snapback recovery, but other things will come in behind it to backfill and result in growth over the next 5 years. For 2022 and beyond, our expectation is that growth will fall, the growth rates will fall more in line with the cyclical recovery in the macroeconomy, in construction activity in general, and even other key end markets like transportation, oil and gas, manufacturing, and even exports. Note that this baseline outlook does not include any consideration for the infrastructure package. Rather, it includes the underlying trend in new construction activity and the $650 billion in infrastructure spend that's already on the books. The infrastructure package itself is clearly the largest upside risk to this current outlook that you have before you. Just how much upside risk? I think this slide does a great job in showing that $550 billion in new physical infrastructure spending is expected to translate into $132 billion in new engineering and design service revenue over the 5-year period. That's about an increase of 5.6% per year over the baseline. So it's a phenomenal, seminal event even. If this happens, if we get the package passed as currently constituted, the industry will need about 82,000 more workers per year over that period. And if one considers our industry's impact on its supply chain and its downstream ripple effect, it will actually result in 250,000 new jobs for Americans. So that does it for me. That's a quick look at some of the top line numbers. Joe and Aaron will spend the rest of the session talking about some of this in more detail. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Joe.
Great. Thanks so much, Ken, for being with us virtually today. And I think if any of you recall from last year when we provided the first industry forecast, we said that in 2020, the industry would be down about 7%. So I'm really happy that we had an accurate forecast for last year. I'm equally as happy that we were wrong about this year.
Yes.
We thought that the engineering and design services industry was going to still be heading in a downward trend this year, but in fact, we have snapped back.
Yeah.
And so I think the story that we first want to talk about today is that the industry as a whole has recovered.
Absolutely. So one of the data points that we track is the Census's quarterly professional services survey, and that showed that in the second quarter of this year, we came back to 2019 levels, and 2019 was the best year ever for design and construction.
Yeah, this really surprised us, and it's great news for the industry. So I'm going to start off with a few slides from the sentiment study that we just conducted. We have not, again, released this yet. We will be doing so in the next week or two. What we've done is we're doing a survey of you all, of your firms, and we've asked you to provide us with your expectations, your current sentiment about the engineering and design services industry. What we're seeing right now in terms of current sentiment is literally off the charts. If you look at the very right side, we call it the net rating. This is when you take positive sentiment and subtract negative sentiment from that number. You can't get over 100% because of the way this is designed. And we're at 84% right now when we're looking at firms' sentiment about their own finances. It's phenomenal right now. We also see this across the board in terms of sentiment about the industry as a whole. A little less positive in terms of the U.S. economy. Yes. I think there's a lot behind that, but still, we're seeing very positive sentiment. Now, what's really interesting about this, Aaron, is that we see large firms are much more positive than smaller firms. Smaller firms are still very positive right now, but there's a huge difference when you look at firm size. We're also seeing big differences in regionality. So firms in the Northeast and the West are not quite as optimistic right now, although still optimistic, compared to firms in the Midwest and in the South.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple takeaways from that. One is a lot of smaller firms do not have the same kind of cash position as larger firms. And they also may be suffering from a bit of a PPP hangover, that's sort of to be determined. So I think that's one of the differences that we see. And then later in our presentation, we're going to talk a little bit more about the different regions and the kind of growth patterns within those regions. The other thing that we want to mention is that if we are going to take questions, so if you go to the conference app and you disagree with the survey, maybe you didn't take it, go ahead and ask us some questions, because we do really want this to be interactive.
Absolutely. And I have one question already. Will you all get a copy of this? I'm sure we're happy to make a copy of this available to you all on the website. So the next slide I want to show you is we asked all of you about particular sectors within the industry and how you all perceive the sectors are performing right now. And as Ken alluded to, and what we're confirming with you all and your sentiment is that data centers are doing the best of all of the sectors that we're tracking. Now, you'll notice that every sector has an extremely positive net rating right now. And so this just underscores the overall recovery that we're seeing in the industry. We also see water and wastewater sector being very positive. Healthcare facilities and telecommunications are all at the top right now.
Right now. So most of these are private markets, so that's awesome for what I do for ACEC. The other thing is that it really shows how our behavior during the pandemic and our behavior right now is contributing to these market sectors and contributing to the built environment. You know, the speaker that we had yesterday morning was very interesting as he sort of reiterated all the downloading from Netflix, all the ordering that we're doing on our phone, all of that kind of behavior, all of the streaming that we're doing on Zoom. And most of you look much taller in person than you do on Zoom, by the way. And so all of that has to go through data centers. You know, it has to go through our telecommunications network, water, wastewater. That is going to support both the water drought that we're having in the West and also, and we'll talk about it in a moment, the boom in single-family residential that we're seeing. So really, it is not a surprise when you think about how much human behavior and how our human behavior is changing really drastically right now, in large part because of the pandemic, and how that's going to contribute to our built environment and our market sectors.
Yeah, this industry really is reflective of the world around us in so many ways. And on the next slide, we can see the relative weakness. Again, overall optimism is very strong, but the relative weakness of areas such as convention centers, sports facilities, places that we gather en masse, which we have not been doing prior.
I mean, we're doing it right now,
we are.
But we have not been doing it
previously. Yeah.
Yes, so much.
There's a big hangover there, and I think there's some current maybe hesitation as to what we're going to see going forward.
Absolutely. You know, I see this reflective in some of the analysis we do. We follow REITs, real estate investment trusts, and it's so interesting to see what's being capitalized and what's not. And you know, if our clients are not predicting growth, those being hotels, office buildings, then they're pausing. And that doesn't provide the same opportunities for our members. So we can see social distancing and how that's interacted with the actual market sectors.
Yeah, but overall, current sentiment is very positive. So let's take a look at some of the other current numbers that you had to share with us, Aaron.
So the next number that we're going to look at is comparing 2020 versus 2019. So this is a regular number that comes out. It's the design and construction spending, construction put in place on an annualized basis. Now what I want us to really look at is sort of the percentage change, because residential is really what brought and kept the market stronger in 2020 from where it had been in 2019. And we saw that non-residential private spending on design and construction started to decline first, but public was still fairly strong. Now, if we go to the next slide, you'll see how we're doing so far.
Sorry, Erin.
That's okay.
I'm in control of slides.
You'll see how we're doing so far this year. So, and Linda has made this point a couple times already. The residential market is more than 26% year-over-year change just from 2020 to 2021. Now this is really, really amazing. We continued to see the decline in private non-residential spending, not a surprise. But one thing that is a little depressing for many of our firms is we've actually seen a decline in the public spending. And really, this is one of the data points that we are using to support our advocacy efforts and try to push for that infrastructure package, which we really hoped would pass so that this would be like a party if we were up here and the infrastructure bill passed. But we will see. But hopefully the stimulus activity that we've seen in the spring already and hopefully the infrastructure package will reverse that public trend so we can get it back in the black.
Okay.
Now this chart, this is a lot. So, and again, we're gonna give you guys copies, but we went ahead and analyzed for a 2-year period from the summer of 2019 through this summer, permits issued for new privately owned housing units. Because when you say to a national audience, residential is up 26%, of course there are folks that are thinking, not where I live, or it's different. So when we look at this, we see that what the census considers the South region, which is basically the Southeast over through the Sun Belt through Texas, has grown over 25%. The Midwest grew during that period over 20%, but the Northeast and the West grew under 5%. And in looking back at some of the sentiment survey questions that we're getting, you can sort of see that correlation. This also really speaks to affordability, land availability, and some of the challenges our home building clients have. Now, when you look at the sort of the flow of the chart, you see that in January of this year, we were at a pace that we really hadn't seen since 2006. The demand is still there, but the pace is slowing down. And that's really what most analysts think is about the supply chain, right? Is about lumber and is about inflation. So, how we sort of see, I'm very curious, because I'm a nerd, to see how the chart is going to look as we keep checking on this month after month.
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, this really underscores some of the regional differences that we're seeing. So when we see sentiment low, it's still positive, but it's not as positive in the Northeast and in the West, and it's driving with your data here. Explain a little bit about what you think is going on there.
Right. So if you're a land development firm and you're in the Sun Belt, you're doing great. In fact, you're probably going to try to hire the kids that were up here earlier because you need more people. But there are other parts of the US that have different kinds of infrastructure, different kinds of need, and different kinds of challenges, especially when it comes to residential and affordability and availability of land. So
yeah, okay. So let's continue. Your next slide.
Anyone who's had to sit through one of my Zooms in the last year knows that I have really been paying attention, as a lot of economists and analysts have, to alternative data metrics. So it used to be that you had to wait for all of these federal sources and other sources to come out with data. And now, because we all walk around with sensors in our pockets, iPhones, and are paying attention to different things, besides the open table metric to see if people are going out to eat and spending consumer dollars, we have something called the U-Haul migration trends metric. So it's basically, this sort of proves the point about the permits, right? Where are people dropping off their U-Haul? Well, they're dropping them off in all of those states that sort of showed that increase. Tennessee, Texas, Florida, the Sun Belt. So we're going to continue to double check the federal government data with things like the U-Haul migration trends index.
Some people may have heard of the Big Mac index as well. So I think this is going to be the ACEC's version of the Big Mac index with you.
It's not the Waffle House index.
Although I love Waffle House.
I love the emergency management index, yeah. So, we have a wonderful land development coalition. Shout out to them. And if you're in land development, go ahead and join those folks. But we have conversations, and when I showed you all that slide before where that top line number from this January, we hadn't seen a number like that since 2006. makes people's heart beat a little faster because you're thinking, is this a bubble? Am I in a bubble? Well, most analysts say no, and one of the main reasons that we're not in a bubble is because of demographics. So again, not necessarily human behavior, but actual population. And so believe it or not, the oldest millennials are about 40, 41. And they came up at a different time than some of us that are older. Maybe they delayed a home purchase, they got married a little later. They have larger student loans, as we keep hearing about. And so they are purchasing houses in much greater volumes than the previous generation. And especially if they're at that age where they've gotten married, they're having kids, now they're all stuck in the house together. So they're thinking, you know, I need a bigger place to live. And so that is really one of the reasons we're seeing that, combined with low interest rates. And because the banking system has put certain checks in place, there does not seem to be a lot of concern about a bubble. The concern is more about how can we keep up this pace? How can we keep up with the inflation in the supply chain and some of the other concerns?
And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Yeah. I do have a few questions here that are coming in.
Okay.
So why don't we turn our attention to these questions. One of the questions here says, I assume the numbers that we're showing here all before understanding the new infrastructure bill. Yes, so, and you saw Ken's numbers as well. He has, here's what's happening if there's no infrastructure bill, and then here's what'll happen. It's kind of like we're on steroids a little bit if we get the infrastructure bill. And the sentiment survey as well. These questions that we're showing you now are about right now. In a minute, we're going to show you future sentiment, and that's where it gets really interesting. All right, another question here is, and I'm going to throw this one at you, Erin, perhaps. Okay. See if we can tackle this one. Can a reduction in procurement help all of us get the stimulus work done, given the tight labor market?
A reduction in procurement?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand what the meaning of that is.
Okay.
Do you?
That's why I asked her the question, because I wasn't quite sure.
I think the biggest, you know, it's exciting to share good news, right? We're getting on a stage. We had this crazy pandemic. We entered a recession. The recession's all of a sudden it's over. And we're like, oh, we're going to have potentially a big infrastructure bill. And I think there's a labor catch-up. So I'm guessing, you know, we're not going to have a reduction in procurement because we're going to continue to grow. Hopefully, we're going to get an infrastructure package. Your necessity for labor, that's the only way you can grow your firm, is to hire more people, win more work, build them out. So, you know, and we're going to get there. But really, that is the biggest concern, is how do we find the people?
Yeah. Okay, and we're going to talk about labor in just a minute. I've got another question on here about labor, so we'll address that in a moment as well. Another question here is, what is considered the West? So when we talk about the regional areas of the United States, in the reports that we put out, you can see a map. We use the census definition. Essentially, the West is to the west of Texas.
Yes. Yeah.
So draw a line straight north from Texas. To the west of that, that's what we consider the West. Okay, so I think everything's looking good right now. You know, I'm feeling good. I like the numbers.
Okay.
I think we're going in a good direction. What's going to happen in the future? Well, guess what? The future is looking pretty good right now. So from the sentiment survey, we asked, how do you think conditions will be 12 months from now? And we asked in all three areas that I showed you previously, for your own firm, for the industry, as well as for the U.S. economy. We see continued strong positive optimism for firms and their own finances. We see almost as strong optimism when it comes to the engineering services industry. Here is, though, we're starting to see maybe some cracks in the armor again with the U.S. economy. People are feeling a little less certain about the overall economy.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? We keep hearing about inflation, supply chain, debt ceiling, and so there's reason for uncertainty, but we'll see.
Yeah. All right, so We also asked about the sectors going forward. This is really interesting here. And the question about the infrastructure bill comes up right here. So if you look at the top sectors in terms of what you all think will be performing the best in the coming year, we see transportation.
12 months from now, yeah.
Roads and bridges, transit, energy and utilities, water and wastewater is still up there, airports. All of these sound a lot like the infrastructure bill.
I think that this reflects a very optimistic crowd who has a lot of faith in ACEC to help get that infrastructure bill passed, to pressure's on. And then in 12 months, my private markets are not at the top anymore, and that's okay. And we're gonna see more of the kinds of, now, there will still be, of course, some private markets, addressed in the infrastructure package, including broadband and telecommunications and that kind of infrastructure in energy and resiliency and that sort of a thing. But yes, certainly when I looked at the sentiment survey, I was like, our members, this is gonna happen.
Yeah, I feel like, looking at the tea leaves as I do, I do think something's gonna pass at some point. It's just there's a lot of horse trading going on right now, I think.
Yeah.
Now, the second half of these sectors, again, we see still relatively strong performance, optimism around data centers, which was our leader currently, industrial manufacturing facilities. But at the bottom, we still see convention centers, these areas where we're all gathering, as well as the justice sector, which includes courthouses and correction centers. So there's still maybe less optimism around that. What's going on with the justice area?
The justice sector, it's very interesting. So this kind of goes back to the concepts around human behavior, what we're experiencing in society, and how that is impacting our funding in our built environment. So, especially our architecture friends and some others, after the social unrest in 2020, have really been giving a lot of thought as to what the justice and the corrections sector should look like. And I think that, not only is that about funding and market expectations, but there also may be a bit of a societal shift in there. And that will be very, very interesting for us to keep an eye on in the future to see if ideas around incarceration and social justice and some other things actually translate into different ways to design and build those kind of facilities. And until there's probably more certainty in that area, we're going to continue to see that market sector near the bottom.
And again, I think it's really interesting that this industry is affected by what's going on in the world around us.
The world has been changing so fast we're seeing things much quicker than we saw previously.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so you do a lot of these snapshots when you're private data market. We don't have time to share all of them.
No, we don't.
But why don't you talk about it?
We only have 20 minutes left. So when I joined ACEC after almost 20 years within member firms, I was asked to analyze the private market. And as you all know, that's a very big market. So I put it in a couple different kinds of buckets, and we're just gonna show a few of these today. So we already talked quite a bit about residential. I wanted to talk a bit more about commercial, because for about the last dozen years, the hottest commercial real estate market sector is warehouses and industrial. It's not sexy. It's not a Class A office building, it's not a fancy hotel, but that continues to be the strongest market sector. And why is that? It's literally because we're buying so much stuff on Amazon. I mean, not literally, but almost literally. And I was digging deep for an article I wrote a few months ago, and it actually even went down to how many people were buying meal kits and other things during the pandemic, and how cold storage and the ability to have cold storage warehouses in certain points of delivery, that was impacting the built environment in the commercial real estate sector so drastically. So it's just really, really fascinating. And then on the next slide, we did want to hit on some of our public sector and P3s. So the second largest market sector, public and private, is actually education. And so we just added that as our 5th private industry brief. We have some outside, and they're on your app under ACEC resources. So we're going to begin analyzing education as well. And obviously that is going to be a steadily growing market because all those millennials are having kids, and they definitely want those kids to go to school after this pandemic. They do not want them home. So we're definitely going to see the education market continue to be strong, and then hopefully we will see some of these other highway and street and other public markets supported by passage of the infrastructure bill.
Yeah, speaking of education, I have to share this one story. I always share a lot of stories when I do my presentations, but I was told I could only do one today because of time. But my daughter is 17 going on 30, right? And she did not like going to school. She hated getting up every day and going to school. And then the pandemic hit, and she thought, oh, we'll be out of school for 2 weeks. Yay, this is great. I'm actually kind of happy. And I told her, because I'm a numbers guy, and I read a book. It was a very thick book about the 1918 flu pandemic.
Oh, goodness.
I know, I'm a nerd too, right? But I think we're surrounded by nerds, so we're in good company.
Yes.
So anyways, I told her, I said, this ain't going away anytime soon. And she's like, what do you mean? I said, you have to be prepared for a life-changing event that your generation will never forget. Yeah. And she was like, well, what does that really mean? I said, you're not going to school for the rest of the year and maybe not next year. And she's like, what? And she is excited to be back in school this year.
Good.
And I know that sorry, I keep hitting my mic. My daughter is not alone here, so she's happy to be back in school.
I mean, we're happy to be back at work. We're happy to be back.
Absolutely. Okay, we've got a few questions here before we get to our next section.
Okay.
A lot of them are surrounding the labor market, and we're going to talk about that. So one thing that's in the economic report that Ken has written and will be releasing soon, there are what we call upside risks to the forecast and downside risks. You heard him mention an upside risk is the infrastructure bill. So if the infrastructure bill passes in a relatively current form, we're going to see an increase over what we currently are anticipating of 5.6% each year. So there's a lot of good news going on there. So a few questions I have here, Aaron. What are the biggest problems that will need engineering solutions?
That's a big question.
I'm giving her all the hard questions.
Well, I think personally, as we're going into COP26 and this and that, I think the biggest problem is going to be around energy and water. I think we have a lot of states and localities that have set very aggressive goals around net zero and carbon emissions. And sometimes as a society, we set a goal because we want to set a great goal. And unfortunately, or fortunately, it's your job to help meet this goal. You know, the two biggest culprits of carbon emissions are buildings and transit and transport. So I think we're really going to be called on to do that as an industry. We're going to have to think differently. And I remember hearing that one of our award winners, a young professional, specializes in doing that kind of a thing. And I just think that that's really, it is a growth opportunity. It's also a big problem that we are going to have to solve. And it's exciting. Yeah.
All right, here's a good one. This one, I think it'll be easier for you. This is definitely aimed at...
I'm gonna, if we ever do this again, I'm holding the iPad.
I know, I'm sorry. Okay, this one says, the question is, if infrastructure passes, is that going to suck the oxygen out of the private market?
Well, I don't think so. You know, and I don't think so for a couple different reasons. So people still need these homes. We still have that residential boom, and you need infrastructure to get to people's homes. You need the broadband, you need the telecommunications, that kind of a thing. Retail follow rooftops. You know, commercial real estate brokers love to say that. Different kinds of retail, not the big malls that are being, you know, going through adaptive reuse, but the kinds of retail and the kinds of commercial that you need. We also have, again, going back to demographics, we have an aging population that will use telehealth for some appointments, but ultimately that's another very stable market, the healthcare and science and technology market. The other thing is, if you really look in the infrastructure package, while there certainly is so much for the public side, there's quite a bit for the private side in, you know, regarding grants and low interest loans and things like that, that will go to energy, that will go to renewable energy, that will go to broadband, that will go to telecommunications. So I don't think that one trumps the other at all, no.
Okay.
I didn't mean to use that word, sorry.
Words take on different meaning nowadays. Okay, so there's a lot of questions here about the labor market, so we want to talk about this. Again, this is one of those downside risks we're potentially looking at.
Downside risk, yes.
There's a lot of people who are currently hiring. And in our sentiment survey, we asked particularly about what are you doing right now with the jobs. So we asked other questions. One of them says, we're hiring right now, we've been hiring, and right now, 9 out of 10 firms say that their organization has at least one open position. The median across the firms, and we got feedback from 500 of you all, so a pretty large sample size. The median was 5 openings. Now, look at these openings by firm size. This is incredible. Firms with 500 or more FTE have a median, meaning half have more openings than this, is 60. That's 10% of the labor in that firm, potentially. And even the smaller firms have a large percentage of openings right now relative to their current labor force. People are looking for folks right now.
I mean, and there's so much that plays into, please don't ask me how we're going to solve this problem, because I don't know. But I think that there's so much that goes into this, because then we're seeing a lot of competition for salaries. We're seeing folks doing hiring bonuses, and we're just seeing such a demand. And then it really leads us to some really structural conversations about how can we change the pipeline? And do we have a labor mismatch? And is the mismatch just about skills and people, or is it about geographies and people? And I know from some of the conversation I've had with our committees and with others that we're also facing a big shift in the expectations of younger workers and how they want to work remotely and where they want to live. And so, how you negotiate with your new employees, how you compete with each other for labor is just, it's going to be so interesting. The other thing is, and we don't have a lot of data yet that's specific to our industry, but you've heard the word she-cession. And this pandemic and this recession has created a burden for a lot of women or a lot of people within their larger families that are either very responsible for kids or responsible for older people. And so I know, having worked in this industry for so many years, that we've done a really good job to try to bring in women and try to promote women within our firms. And so I think that we also have to recognize the challenge of the moment, and that perhaps there's an opportunity here for us to think about flexibility and think about not only, as you know, it's hard to get someone, it's hard to hire. Hiring is expensive, getting someone in. So being able to retain the best talent that you have and how you do that, I think is going to be so key.
Yeah, I think it is probably one of the biggest challenges we're facing. In addition to supply chain issues, which Ken talks about in his report as well, and all of these issues potentially leading to more inflation, which the official line out of Washington right now is, oh, it's temporary, it's not going to last that long.
Transitory.
Transitory.
I looked it up.
Yeah, and I personally, I should say for my professional opinion, but it's also my personal opinion, is I don't think this is going away that quickly. At least within the engineering industry, because we are looking at an infrastructure bill that if it passes, we're going to need to hire another 82,000 workers a year.
82,000 more people is a lot.
People, right. Yeah, it's a lot of people. So one of the other things we asked was, looking forward, what are you anticipating doing in terms of hiring? So we've been hiring. There's a big current hiring surge going on, and 3/4 of firms say that they are expecting a further increase over the next year.
They're optimistic. They think the infrastructure bill is going to pass, so they're getting ready.
And again, we do see differences, the same ones regionally as well as firm size, but across the board, everybody feels like there's going to be more hiring at their firms. So last year I was talking, or earlier this year, I was talking about how the recovery has been fairly uneven, because we had about 1/3 of firms who were saying we're still not back to pre-pandemic levels, and 1/3 saying we're doing better. Right now it seems like we're hearing a whole lot more from most firms that they're doing quite well. But again, some of those smaller firms, you mentioned when we were talking about this earlier that if they specialize in a particular area that is not doing as well, they may not be doing as well either.
Right. I think that goes back to the regional and the market differentiators. So again, if you're a land development firm or you're a water wastewater firm and you're in a growing region, you're having a lot of success. If you're an MEP firm that does hotels and resorts, maybe not, or stadiums. So I think that really, and that's part of our members also, they're very resilient and they can also open themselves up to new markets. Certainly that will help. But overwhelmingly, everything is very positive.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a few more minutes here and a lot of questions have come in.
Okay.
So I'm going to try to get through some of these as best I can. I'll keep throwing you the hard ones, of course.
Okay.
Okay, so we've sort of touched on this one. This is a softball. Do you think the passage of the infrastructure bill could create a capacity problem in the engineering and construction industries?
A capacity problem as far as the labor market, yes, because I think we already have the problem. And so the passage of the infrastructure bill will worsen the problem.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely, 100%. So that one was easy to answer. Let's see here. Okay, I'm going to let you answer this one as well while I read the others.
Okay.
Texas, we talked about what is the West.
Yeah.
And if you just draw a line to the West, then, okay. So this one is, Texas is a wide state.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, thank you, and I agree.
Is the person from Texas that asked this question?
I don't know. It's funny. I made it funny. I don't know. But anyways,
okay.
Where do Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas fall? So do you want to take this one?
I don't have the census regions memorized.
I do. Come on.
Okay.
Yeah, I kind of do, actually.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so anyways, if you go north of Texas, Oklahoma is still in the south.
Okay.
Then you get to the Midwest.
Okay.
So there's upper Midwest, and there's the 9 census region and the 4 census region. So we can break it down even further. But I'm going to geek out on y'all here.
Texas is definitely in the south.
But Texas is the south. North Dakota, South Dakota, that's the Midwest. So hopefully that answers your question. And you can always do a Google search for
I left my phone on the table, so I can't Google any answers.
Oh, I'm not saying you can, but
I know.
Yeah, the audience.
Okay.
This is, okay, one more story. I have to throw this in. So my daughter always asks me questions. I have dinner with her and my son at lunch on Sunday, and she's always asking me questions. And I'm like, she's constantly on her phone, And I'm like, do you know how to use Google? And she's like, duh, of course I do, Dad. And I'm like, okay, well, how about you Google these questions? So anyways, I tell her to Google things all the time now. All right. This is an interesting one. I'll take this one, Erin.
Okay.
In your opinion, how do you think the potential vaccine mandate will impact the industry, the economy, and the ability to retain employees? This is a really good question.
This is a really good one. This has also been I was with some of our lovely members last night after dinner, and we had quite a bit of conversation around this.
Yeah. So we just last Friday issued what we call a quick poll. Some of you probably saw it and took the survey. We closed it out on Monday. We've been a little bit busy this week with the conference, but I can tell you that at the moment, we're seeing not a lot of firms issuing mandates. So a little sneak peek on this research, about 20% of firms indicated that they have some type of requirement. Now, that requirement does not mean it's a vaccine requirement. It means that there's some requirement that you either get vaccinated, or if you're not going to get vaccinated, you have exemptions, or you might get tested. So, but only 20% of firms right now have some type of requirement.
So I'm going to assume that if we carved up the kinds of markets that the firms work at, we would get different kinds of reactions or different senses of what they need to do. If the federal government does continue to require vaccinations, and we have lots of members that have lots of folks deployed on federal contracts, that is going to change things significantly. And I know that's an issue that ACEC is working on right now. And there's also, again, going back to human behavior, if an employee philosophically is on the fence, but they know potentially that they will lose their role within a company, would that change their behavior? And I don't think we know the answers to those questions yet, so.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one more question here. We might have time for another one, but this one here, this is a good one. I like this one as well. The Northeast rates low on economic optimism, yet very high for additional staffing. So this is something we talked a little bit about because we saw this difference. What's going on there?
Well, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm from New England. And I was listening to Bloomberg earlier this week, and they had the governor of Connecticut on, and he was talking about the infrastructure package, and he said it very plainly, so I'm going to use his words. He said, I'm from an old state. Our infrastructure is old. We have aging infrastructure. So I think within the Northeast, there is a lot of optimism. We're not seeing a single-family residential boom necessarily like you see in other parts of the country, but it is the oldest infrastructure in the country. And it's still the most populous region in the country is between Boston and Washington, D.C. So when you think about everything in that infrastructure package and how that may help transform some of the older infrastructure, I think that's the reason for a lot of optimism.
Yeah, and the other thing we talked about previously was that we really do feel like the private market, and particularly residential, is sort of fueling this excessive optimism almost, in the South particularly,
right.
And even in the Midwest.
Right.
And your U-Haul index, shows that it shows exactly where people are moving by dropping off the U-Hauls. So, I think there's a lot going on, sort of underneath the surface there. And also, I just want to mention with the vaccines, which we were talking about, I do think we're going to see changes. Once the federal government says, "Yep, you better have the vaccines, or we're cutting off your work," and the Biden administration is supposedly coming out and going to say, "Yeah, if you have 100 or more employees, you're required." We're going to, I think, see changes. And we saw that in some of the open-ended comments to the survey, that a lot of firms are waiting to see what the actual rule is, how it is read.
With such a tight labor market, you have to keep every employee, every good employee you've got to keep them.
And the good news is, from that survey that we did, we are not seeing a lot of people leaving right now because of policies in place or a lack of policies. That was something that surprised me out of this survey that we're going to release, is that, again, very few, but we're seeing some people leave because their firms aren't requiring vaccination or testing. So it's going both ways. It's really interesting dynamic right now. All right, well, we got 30 seconds left here. The timer's counting down.
Okay.
We didn't get to all of the questions. I'm really sorry we weren't able to do that. But thank you all so much for being here and for sharing this time with us. And again, please watch your email inboxes. We will be releasing all these studies in their entirety very soon. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Robin.
Thanks, Joe. Joe and Aaron and everybody at the ACEC Research Institute, thank you for that fantastic presentation. That was amazing. And that was